let's get started with this story about the New York Times article. So I think it was just a couple of weeks ago, Max Blumenthal actually at the Gray Zone, they debunked this story. They said that there was no evidence to prove that these assaults actually took place on October 7th. And then also, Max Blumenthal actually went on to Rising and had this discussion with Bree and Robbie as well. So he actually did do his homework. I'm noticing there's a lot of people giving a shout out to The Intercept for breaking this story, but the Gray Zone actually broke this story first. So I do want to say that. Let's start off by saying that, because I think it needs to be said. Okay, it needs to be said. They actually debunked this story first. So without further ado, let's get into this clip here now. This is actually a reporter here from the New York Post, and I'm pretty sure they were very happy to call out the New York Times. I consider them competitors, like, so to speak. So let's get into this about this so-called assault on October 7th that they said took place, and why the New York Times is facing so much scrutiny today. Here we go.
The New York Times is reviewing its ties to a freelance journalist based out of Israel who clicked like on a social media post that called for Israel to turn Gaza into a quote-unquote slaughterhouse. The woman's name is Anat Schwartz. She's a 45-year-old director and freelance journalist. She was a co-author of a controversial Times story that alleged that Hamas committed a mass rape during its October 7th attack, which left 1,200 Israelis dead. That was quite controversial inside the Times newsroom, because apparently there's debate among Times staffers as to whether that story had sufficient evidence to back up the claims. There have been anecdotes and stories of eyewitness testimonies saying that they saw Hamas terrorists rape Israeli women on October 7th, but the Israeli government has not confirmed those accounts, nor have they provided any sort of forensic analysis that would confirm instances of mass rape. Of course, Hamas has denied those claims. But now, as a result of these viral social media posts that Schwartz liked about Israel's actions in Gaza, the newspaper is now reviewing its association with her. And apparently there are also reports that the Times is planning to cut ties with Schwartz as well.
So they have officially cut ties with her. And there's more that I'm going to tell you about that he did not mention there. But like I said, I think the New York Post was very happy to throw the New York Times under the bus. Anat Schwartz is not just, a freelance so-called reporter. And I'm going to use that word loosely, reporter. And we'll get into those details as well. Yes. It was revealed on Twitter that she liked multiple posts that involve the genocide of the Palestinian people. She was also a former IDF soldier, intelligence officer. So she worked for the IDF intelligence. Do you think that that was the right person to have report this story? No bias there whatsoever, right? Let's get into this, because there is so much to be said about this. Again, it goes to show you about how the media shapes the narrative and how they control the narrative. So you always got to look into who these journalists are and a little bit about their background. So let's get into this here from Common Dreams. New York Times reviewing Israeli reporter who, move this thing out the way, liked Gaza slaughterhouse post. This is honestly veering on journalistic malpractice, and the New York Times owes its readers an explanation. Let's dive into this here. We are aware that a freelance journalist in Israel who has worked with the Times has liked several social media posts. This is coming from Danielle Rhodes, a spokesperson for the newspaper. Those likes are unacceptable violations of our company policy. We are currently reviewing the matter. So the idea is that you are supposed to be unbiased, right? Confirmation of the review came after the popular account Z Squirrel on X, formerly Twitter, highlighted Friday that Schwartz had liked the hateful slaughterhouse message from editor and radio presenter David Mizrahi and other posts circulating misinformation about the October attack. And this is Z Squirrel. And I told you guys before, make sure you follow this account. Z Squirrel was the first person that said, oh my God, one of the three authors of the New York Times assault atrocity propaganda hoax is Anat Schwartz. She liked posts calling for Gaza to be turned into a slaughterhouse. This is the person the New York Times hired to write about Palestinians and frame them as subhuman monsters. Now, I would not be surprised if they knew exactly who she was. And maybe they were just caught. I would not be surprised. Again, what narrative has the New York Times been running with? They've been running with a pro-Israel narrative. So don't forget that. Now you can see the tweet here where it says Anat Schwartz, and it shows that she liked this post where it says here, turn the strip into a slaughterhouse. If a hair falls from their head, execute security prisoners, violate any norm on the way to victory. From them to see and be seen. She liked that. Okay. So she was in favor of the genocide of the Palestinian people. Z Squirrel goes on to say she also liked posts repeating the 40 beheaded babies hoax. This is unbelievable. The New York Times got Annette along with Adam Sella and Jeffrey Gentleman, both of whom are also rabid Zionist maniacs, to freely express their deep racist contempt of Palestinians. Holy shit. And then here's another one that Anat actually liked as well. That's the 40 babies murdered. She liked that tweet. It goes on to say here, Esha Krishnaswamy, host of the podcast Historic.ly, who also began digging into Schwartz's online activity and history, said Saturday on X that she has reactivated her account, but she has purged it of all her previous genocidal likes. So again, if she didn't do anything wrong, why would she try to hide that information now? The newspaper's social media policy states, in part, that journalists must not express partisan opinions, promote political views, endorse candidates, make offensive comments, or do anything else that undercuts the Times' journalistic reputation, and should be especially mindful of appearing to take sides on issues that the Times is seeking to cover objectively. I can just tell you, as someone who is on social media, they're not following that rule. I've seen a number of New York Times journalists behave in such a partisan way. So that rule that they have isn't even, enforced. A filmmaker whose LinkedIn identifies her as working at the Israeli Public Broadcasting Corporation. Schwartz contributed to Times reporting from November to January, focusing on the attack and Israel's retaliation in Gaza, which has killed over 30,000 Palestinians and is being investigated by the ICJ as genocide. Schwartz has bylines on multiple pieces about accusations that Hamas militants committed sexual violence during the attack on Israel. She repeatedly collaborated with Times international correspondent Jeffrey Gentleman and Adam Sella, who have written dozens of articles for the paper since mid-October, and is reportedly her nephew. Oh, no issue there. Family members, what do you know? And here's a tweet here from Jonathan Cook that says, a freelance reporter pivotal to the Hamas attack story. The New York Times eventually walked back because it was so evidence light, is found to have been liking tweets promoting genocide in Gaza, another normal day in corporate media land. Goes on to say here, the Times had to add a correction to a December report by the trio, clarifying that Israeli police are relying mainly on witness testimony, not on autopsies or forensics evidence. And by the way, some of the alleged victims have actually already walked back their story. I don't know if you guys have heard that, but some of them have already walked it back. So keep that in mind. Another report from Schwartz, Sella, and Gentleman screams without words how Hamas weaponized sexual violence on October 7th appeared on the front page of the print edition on Sunday, December 31st. Now, remember, Hillary Clinton actually gave a speech at Columbia University about these attacks, these alleged attacks. Is Hillary Clinton going to issue a retraction? No, of course not. Then, citing newsroom sources, The Intercept reported last month that the Times pulled a high-profile episode of its podcast, The Daily, about sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th, amid a furious internal debate about the strength of the paper's original reporting on the subject. So I just want to highlight here, because a lot of people are crediting The Intercept. That is not to say they did not do their work. They did, but I do want to make sure we give credit where credit is due, that the Gray Zone actually debunked this story first. Let's all remember that. A newspaper spokesperson, Charlie, told the outlet at the time, as a general matter of policy, we do not comment on the specifics of what may or may not publish in the New York Times or our audio programs. The Intercept's Ryan Grimm said Sunday that sources told him the Times is now cutting ties with Schwartz. He also pointed out that the paper's podcast hasn't put out an episode related to their reporting. As attention on Schwartz over the weekend, multiple other U.S. journalists weighed in on social media. So here's Evan Overbay. WTAF, this Anat Schwartz scandal is approaching, if not surpassing, Judith Miller levels. The fact that her reporting skewed public perception of the events on October 7th is appalling. This is honestly veering on journalistic malpractice, and the New York Times owes its readers an explanation. I sometimes joke, it's another good day not to be the New York Times public editor, but the organization could really use one right now to investigate on behalf of its readers. That's coming from Margaret Sullivan, who held the role for 4 years. Philadelphia Inquirer columnist Will Bunch, he wrote that as a veteran journalist, I know there are a lot of award-winning reporters who would kill to get their byline in the New York Times. But a filmmaker with zero experience shows up and gets on the front page covering the world's most controversial story. Something here is not right. So something that I do want to add as well, she did not have any reporting experience. And for those of you that have actually done journalism, or you're a freelance reporter, you know how hard it can be to actually get your story published by a mainstream outlet. It's very difficult, right? Unless you're seasoned and they know you and you have connections. But the fact that she had her story published on the front page and she had absolutely no journalist experience, all of a sudden she was labeled a journalist after October 7th. She was a filmmaker. Again, another way for them to control the narrative. The Times, like other U.S. dailies, has long been accused of anti-Palestinian bias, criticism that has ramped up in response to the paper's coverage of Israel's 4-month attack on Gaza. And here's a tweet here from Esha K. How does the New York Times report actual hunger and starvation in Gaza? Passive tense. And this is an example. Thirst and hunger grow in besieged Gaza amid Israeli bombardment. Residents wait in line for hours for bread and water, with fights sometimes breaking out. So, yeah, they talked about it in past tense. She goes on to say Israel deliberately blocking aid is reported with passive tense. See, inspections, bottlenecks, and safety concerns hinder Gaza's aid. Obstacles at 2 border crossings are exacerbating a growing humanitarian crisis, according to 2 U.S. senators and officials with the UN and other groups. So these things have been very revealing here, and I want to show you a little bit more about Anat that I think that you should see. And I even pointed this out on Twitter as well. I said, I seem to remember the Gray Zone debunked the New York Times sexual story early on. How does the New York Times hire a former IDF member to cover the war in Gaza? Easy, to spread propaganda. Now, I am incredibly glad that I took a screenshot of this, because I'm going to show you what her wiki page looks like now, and it is different. Now, this is her wiki page here. Actually, I'll leave it back how it was because it's bigger this way. So it says Anat Schwartz, right? It says is a film director and reporter. So this is what her wiki page previously said. Reporter. Schwartz was born in Haifa and grew up in Ramat Afel. She graduated from the Thelma Yellin High School of the Arts, majoring in theater, and served in the IDF and Air Force intelligence. So the New York Times didn't know who they were hiring. There was no again, this was done by Google. There was no background check, no nothing. I think they knew exactly who she was. They're just upset that they were caught. So all of a sudden she was a journalist. That was the thing that killed me. That just came out of nowhere, right? So again, this is the older wiki page that she had. Even when you look at her experience, it talks about film, television. In 2005, she produced and directed a film. So it talks about Cannes Film Festival. It talks about how she was an assistant director. But notice there is nothing here about her work as a journalist. That is because she wasn't one. She was a former IDF soldier who basically gave herself the title as journalist and said she was freelance. I don't even call myself a journalist. I say I'm a host of a show. And all of a sudden, just like that, without the experience, she was able to get her story on the front page with no evidence, no forensics, just a couple of witnesses that have also started to retract their story. And the New York Times just ran with it. This goes beyond journalistic malpractice. This is all about narrative control. The New York Times, the New York Post, the Washington Post, all of these mainstream outlets are controlling the narrative. And who is telling them what narrative to push? The people who are invested in these networks, the shareholders, the owners. These outlets are getting money from somewhere, right? Now let's see what her wiki page says now. Her new page doesn't even show a picture of her face. How convenient. Now, when you search for Anat Schwartz, it says she's an Israeli film director, content data analyst, and writer. So we went from she's a film director and reporter to she is a film director, content data analyst, and writer. Everybody see what's happening here? This is still the same. They still mention she served in the Israeli Air Force Intelligence Division. So that's still there. Now they've highlighted more with the filmmaking, but notice there's less information here about filmmaking. And now there's this section for content data analysts. Schwartz worked in the data industry. She joined the Israeli company Vault, I think that's AI, in 2020 as a content data analyst. And here's the whole write-up about the New York Times article, which is now there as well. The social media controversy and aftermath as well. But like I said, you see how quickly that was switched around? And I just think it's very convenient that now you do not see her picture on the Wikipedia page, whereas before you did. You have to question mainstream media. I'm not telling you not to watch it, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. And then you have to do your own research. I've called out the New York Times multiple times before. Their reporting has been horrible. It's obvious that they have an agenda, but they're not alone. The New York Times also smeared Aaron Bushnell, the Air Force soldier who set himself on fire. So did the Washington Post. All of these outlets did this. The narrative control is to support Israel and to make Israel appear in a positive light, even if that means that you have to hire someone who was a former IDF soldier who lied about being a journalist, had no journalistic experience, who was actually a film director, former IDF soldier, and you get them to create a story for you without any forensic evidence in reference to sexual assault. This is where we're at now, ladies and gentlemen. The times have changed. Gone are the days of reporting that my parents were used to and my grandparents were used to, where people would actually hit the street, get real evidence, and report the facts, just the facts. All of these outlets have a partisan sway, all of them. They can say that they don't, but they do. So she has been called out, and the Gray Zone were the first ones to debunk that story. And it's a good day for independent media.